I want to tell you something that I find extraordinary about knitting. The way we knit today, the exact movement and technique, is the same way people knitted 1,000 years ago. In Egypt, in Iceland, in the fishing villages of Ireland. The tools have changed a little, and so has the yarn, but the stitch itself remains completely unchanged. So when you knit, you're not just making something. You are joining a long line of makers that stretches back further than almost anything else we make with our hands. Because the history of knitting is not just the history of a craft, it is the history of us. Where it all began. Let's start at the very beginning, which, as it turns out, is not quite where most people think it is. If you search for the history of knitting, you will often find claims that knitting is thousands and thousands of years old. Some sources even claim that it is ancient beyond measure. But this actually comes from a very understandable case of mistaken identity. Because for a long time, historians confused knitting with a different technique called nålebinding. But nålebinding is a different technique entirely. It uses a single needle and short lengths of yarn, and you work each stitch individually. The finished fabric looks remarkably similar to knitting though. So similar that in fact for decades even experts couldn't tell them apart. The oldest nålebinding that was found dates back to around 6,500 years before Christ in what is today Israel. So you can see how the confusion arose. But nålebinding is not knitting, and once historians were able to recognize that, the history of knitting had to be rewritten. So, when did knitting actually begin? The honest answer is we don't know exactly, because there are no ancient gods related to knitting. There are no legends or founding myths associated with it. And if you compare it to, let's say, weaving, that has the Greek goddess Athena as its patron, for example. Knitting simply appeared someday. But what we do know is that the earliest confirmed knitted objects come from Egypt. And they date from around the 11th to the 15th century. Beautiful blue and white cotton socks. Some of them with a separate section for the big toe, so they could be worn with sandals. So, socks with sandals is, as it turns out, historically accurate. But what I find most interesting about these old Egyptian socks is that those socks were not simple. They were not the work of someone trying to learn how to knit. They included color work. Some of them even had some Arabic words stitched into them like a good luck charm. And they also had turned heels. So whoever made them clearly had been knitting for a long period of time, which means that knitting might even be older than those socks suggest. We just have not found the evidence for that yet. How knitting conquered Europe. So by the 11th century, knitting already existed and it was already remarkable. But it was still very much contained to Egypt and the Arabic world. And the question is how it traveled from there into the rest of the world. The answer, as with so many things in history, is trade. Because through the Mediterranean trade routes, knitting slowly traveled northward and westward into Europe. And when it did, something interesting happened because different places adopted knitting in different ways. In England, knitting became something almost everyone did. Men, women and children. It was ordinary, everyday and democratic. In fact, it became so popular that in the Channel Islands in the 17th century, people started refusing to bring in the harvest. They had decided that knitting was more profitable than working their landlord's land, so they simply didn't show up. As you can imagine, the landlords were not pleased, and there was actually a law established that forbid to knit during harvest season. And on the contrary, in mainland Europe, knitting took a very different direction. It was a professional trade controlled by guilds, what we might today call unions, and to belong to one of these guilds was a serious undertaking. To become a master knitter, you had to be male and you had to serve as an apprentice for up to 5 years. After that period of time, you traveled and visited other masters and worked for them. And only after that, you were able to do your final examination. That examination required you to produce several masterworks. One guild in Vienna in 1609 required candidates to knit a table carpet in 6 different colors, a beret, a pair of silk stockings, and a pair of gloves. And the carpet alone was roughly 6 feet by 6 feet, which is about 2 square meters, knitted at around 20 stitches to the inch. Those were extraordinary pieces of work. But there is one thing about the guilds that I find both fascinating and rather infuriating at the same time. Once a master knitter had his own workshop, he could hire unskilled workers to help him, and those workers were often women. But there were very strict rules about what women were allowed to do. For example, women were considered too intellectually limited to turn a heel. So a woman would cast on for a sock and knit the leg of the sock, but when it came to turning the heel, she had to hand it to the master, who then turned the heel for her. Then he handed it back to her so that she could knit the foot, and when it came to the toe, she had to give it back to the master. Now, while all of this was happening in the workshops and guilds in Europe, knitting also quietly made its way into art, because during the 13 and 1400s, more and more artists started painting the Virgin Mary knitting. And there is a beautiful example from 1400 from the German artist Bertram von Minden. He painted the Madonna knitting what is thought to be a small garment on long double-pointed needles. Knitting, it seems, was considered a sufficiently noble and gentle activity for the most revered woman in Christian art. And by the 1500s, knitting made its way firmly into European fashion. Silk stockings, lace decorative borders, and the first published knitting pattern that appeared in a Danish book of needlework in 1524. Knitting had arrived, and it wasn't going anywhere. Knitting in wartime. By the time we reached the 20th century, knitting had long moved out from the guilds and into everyday homes. It was ordinary, an everyday craft, and something you did by the fire in the evening. And then the world went to war. During the First World War, knitting transformed almost overnight from a domestic pastime into something that felt urgent and necessary. Men, women, and children who were left at home while their fathers and sons and brothers went to the front, they all knitted. And what they knitted above almost everything else was socks. And there is a very specific reason for that. Because the boots that were given to the soldiers were so rigid and poorly made that once you started walking in them, the sole separated from the other part of the boot, and that meant that water could get in easily, and once you were in the trenches with wet feet, that could mean gangrene, infection, and you also faced a possible amputation in the worst case. So having warm, dry feet and well-made socks wasn't just a comfort, it was truly a question of life or death. Americans alone knitted an estimated 1.3 million pairs of socks for the war effort. And that is just Americans. The British were knitting, the Germans were knitting, the French were knitting too. There was even a famous knit-a-thon held in Central Park in New York in 1918, where hundreds of people were sitting together in the open air knitting for the front. Now, and this is one of my favorite pieces of the knitting history, do you know where the term Kitchener stitch comes from? On the very first day that war was declared in Britain, the Minister of War, who was a man named Lord Kitchener, published a notice in British newspapers, and he was asking people to knit socks for the soldiers. And he was very specific. All socks must have a seamless heel and a seamless toe. That was important because socks that were made by machines during that time always had a seam at the toe, which means that there was like a small ridge that was rubbing against the feet when walking, which could of course cause blisters, infections, and then all the bad consequences that we already talked about. Lord Kitchener didn't seem to know the technical term of what he was asking. He just kept repeating the word seamless over and over. But knitters knew exactly what he meant, and they started using this technique and started to create this seamless join or seamless graft of the toe, which is still today named Kitchener stitch, named after a British Minister of War. I think this is just so fascinating. And then we come to World War II, which brought a different kind of story. This time rationing was severe. In Britain, civilian women received 66 clothing coupons per year. A simple cardigan in fingering weight yarn, for example, used 7 of those coupons, which meant that every stitch of yarn had to be accounted for. Patterns from this era are full of phrases like coupon saver and make it stretch and use what you have. But there is one story that is extremely touching and that has stayed with me ever since I read it. There was a young Jewish girl called Christina Tschigel from Poland who escaped with her family, and they literally had nothing, only the clothes that they wore. And Christina was wearing a cardigan that her grandmother had knitted for her. Her grandmother had knitted a sweater for her every year, and Christina loved them. That sweater became one of her only possessions for several years. She wore it and cared for it through unimaginable hardship. And when the war ended and she eventually came to America, she donated it to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And she also named her memoir after it. It is called The Girl in the Green Sweater. I think that really shows what knitting truly is. An object made with love, by hand, carrying someone through the worst years of their life. I just don't think there is a better illustration of what knitting truly is. From decline to revival. After the war ended, knitting returned to something quieter, but also more joyful. Pattern books from the 1950s are full of cheerful colors and playful designs, like dog sweaters, children's toys, cardigans for watching television in. And there was even a pattern book called TV Knits, designed specifically for projects that are simple enough to work on while watching a favorite program. It seems like this was almost like a deep exhale after years of urgency. And then the 1970s arrived and knitting had a true moment. There was a broad cultural hunger during this decade for handmade things, natural materials, and a rejection of the synthetic and mass-produced. Knitting fit perfectly into that mood. It was creative, tactile, and unique. Imagine bold textures, strong colors, and extravagant designs. But by the mid-1980s, something shifted. Fast fashion had arrived. Cheap machine-made clothing flooded the market. And suddenly knitting started to feel unnecessary, at least to some people. It started to feel quaint, like something only grandmothers did. But during those same decades, there were 2 women whose extraordinary work laid the groundwork for what knitting would become later on. The first one was Elizabeth Zimmermann. She was opinionated, witty, and very revolutionary. She told knitters to have fun while knitting. She championed modular knitting, seamless knitting, using circular needles, and to trust your instincts. And she also is often famously quoted for the saying that if you cut open your steek with a scissor, so you basically cut through your knitting, that you should afterwards lay down in a dark room until the uneasy feeling has passed. And the second one was Barbara Walker. She did many remarkable things, but one thing that she popularized was the top-down knitting, so starting at the neck and working your way downwards when knitting a sweater. And this makes it a lot easier to try the sweater on and see the fit as you go. So if you have ever knitted a sweater from the top down, you have to thank Barbara Walker for it. Both of these women were working during the so-called dark ages of knitting, and both of them planted seeds that flowered later. Now, I have made separate videos about both of these remarkable women, which I will link for you both on the screen and in the description box. In the early 2000s, something began to change. A website called Ravelry launched in 2007. It was and still is a social network for knitters and crocheters. And within a few years, it had millions of members. Suddenly, knitters could find each other, share patterns, discuss techniques, and build communities across continents. And knitting started to become visible again. The slow fashion movement started to gain momentum, rejecting cheaply made, fast made fashion pieces, things that are disposable, and valuing handmade things, things that take time, things that you want to care for instead of, having an overflowing wardrobe but still feel like you have nothing to wear. And I do have to say, I very much find myself in that category as well. For many people, knitting became more than a hobby. It was a quiet act of resistance against a world that seemed to be moving too fast. And then in 2020, the world stopped. During the pandemic, many people, everyone suddenly found themselves confined to their homes, anxious and nervous, and many people started knitting for the first time or returned to knitting after a long absence. There is nothing more comforting, I think, than this meditative, rhythmic movement with your hands if you just don't know what the future holds. And during that time, knitting found a new generation. Young people on TikTok sharing their projects, designers building what are essentially small fashion houses around their pattern collections, and a Harry Styles cardigan that sent thousands of teenagers to their local yarn shops. Knitting is no longer something you apologize for. It is something you are proud of, something you share, and it's something that connects you with every other person who has ever picked up needles and a yarn before and made something with their hands. And that brings us all the way back to the beginning. I'm sitting here in front of a castle that is several hundred years old, and I'm knitting. And somehow that feels exactly right. Because that is what knitting is. It's not a trend. It's not a hobby that comes and goes. It is something that has been woven into human life for over 1,000 years. Through wars and hardship, through fashion and poverty, through isolation and community. Every time you pick up your needle, you are a part of that. The woman in medieval Egypt who knitted Arabic words into her socks for good luck. The women in the Channel Islands who decided knitting was more important than the harvest. The millions of hands that knitted socks for soldiers in the trenches. Christina Chiga carrying her grandmother's green sweater through the worst years of her life. And you and me, right now, making something with our hands. Now I hope that this journey through the history of knitting has given you a new appreciation for the craft we share. And I hope that next time you sit down with your knitting, that you remember for even just a moment that there is a long line of makers behind you. And if you've enjoyed this video, I think you're also going to like this one. Until next time, take care. Bye.